Really, this program is about inviting all your other neighbors into your yard, as well as all your friends and family and human neighbors. At Pickering Creek, we're all about community-based conservation. We love and local residents can visit, and when we are able to open from dawn to dusk, come out. Right now, our visitation hours are from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So if you haven't had a chance to stretch your legs, please feel free to come on out and enjoy our trails. We at Pickering Creek are all about great habitat. Other words for that are beautiful landscapes like the wetlands you see here, our meadows, our forests, and woodlands along the creek side. All of these places provide great homes and great places to visit. So these meadows that you see before you, if you've been out to Pickering, I know quite a few of you volunteered and also come out and enjoy the trails. This may look very familiar to you as both the older wetlands that were established and our newer ones that were established in 2014. Obviously, as part of National Audubon Society, we're very again that if you make a great home for birds, you're gonna make a really great home for all the other things that are hanging out, for example, in the wetland. We go out with our kids, and not only do we get to see things like this beautiful wood duck, we also get to see lots of frogs, lots of tadpoles, crayfish, and other things in our wetlands. And in our meadows, just to remind you, not only are we getting our sparrows, but we're also getting our bees and butterflies and other pollinators as well. So oftentimes when we think of habitat restoration, you think of big plantings in wild spaces, which we do at Pickering. And we've done many of the places in the wetlands we planted with students and volunteers at various points over the years. But I'd like you to travel with me on the Pickering map, move from the freshwater wetlands and the view of this picture that you saw, and come down the lane a little bit to the gardens. You may know that the herb garden is there, but Pickering volunteers have also worked very hard on a space that might be very familiar to you. You might have seen the Settler's Garden. It's smack dab in the middle of sort of Pickering, and it's a great place to pop in. You're looking at a garden that has been in transition for the entire time I've been at Pickering. Right now, its newest iteration. Students have worked with us along with volunteers to plan out and plant a more bird and wildlife friendly garden. And this is the results of their efforts as of early April and May. We'll show you a little bit later what that is looking at like. We had them come out last April and they did the layout. We had them plant. These students are from Caroline County High Schools. They worked with us on the environmental, I'm having a moment. Yes, habitat restoration. That's what they worked with us on, and they're busy at it during their planting day here in the gardens. This is what we call our pollinator island, and this is what it's looking like right now if you popped out. Things are blooming, and they have been blooming quite nicely. We have tall things like the Rebecca Maxima. We have some lovely things like a lot of Penn State students was to not only help people to see that you can create special places for wildlife in the wild, but these are things that that you can bring into your yard and invite your wild neighbors to share spaces with you. That's that lovely penstemon I was talking about that's in that pollinator island or the central garden bed. Often though, when we think about neighborhoods and our neighbors and a well-maintained yard, they look a little bit like this. This is a very nicely maintained yard, but it's pretty sterile and unappealing for the wild neighbors. So how could we move from having a really lovely space, but not necessarily inviting for our wild neighbors, and move it into a space where our wild neighbors would be happy to visit us, or maybe even set up shop and move nearby. Bring
Samantha?
families.
Samantha, I'm gonna.
Won't we all, if we're living near or in a woodland like here at Pickering Creek? Yes.
So I'm getting a little bit of down, and I wanted to try before we switch. If you want to try turning off your video.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
We're going to see if we can make that work.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, give me another yell, or please drop a note in the comments in the chat section if any of you are having a hard time with future audio issues. So wouldn't we like to invite something like this lovely wood thrush to move into our neighborhood with us, where we could see the chicks coming up? Or for me, where I'm at, sometimes the little Carolina wrens like to set up shop, and that's always very exciting, or the cardinals. Any family, I'm pretty much willing to have any family move into my neighborhood. So it's very exciting. Oops. We'll get there. So what if we could take the beautiful palette of colors and textures and variety found the native plants and use a few basic concepts that make great habitat, or why transform them in a way that beautifies our yards, brings us joy, and invites others into our spaces. That's entirely possible. We're going to spend time during this presentation focusing a lot on native plants and a few tips just to get started about what makes a great habitat and what you can do to kind of use those tips to enhance whatever space you may be imagining or working on. Perhaps you're already familiar with Doug Tallamy's work, Bringing Nature Home. It's a nice guide and it's a quick read. If you like it, I would suggest taking it out. But there are a few key concepts that you can take away very quickly that are useful for everybody. You can help birds right away by reducing the amount of space where you need lots of cut grass or pavement. It doesn't mean getting rid of it. You might want to walk way up to your home or driveway. But if you can reduce the lawn, if there are no grandchildren running in that piece of lawn and it's a bit on the edge of your property, that might be a really great place to invite in more wild spaces. So reducing lawn or pavement. And if you could plant natives wherever you can. It's really lovely to have some garden plants. We all have our favorites. I would love to hear about plants that you have growing or some things that bring you joy if you have plants in your garden. If you go down to the chat box and you pop it in, Mary Helen or Harrison, let me know what those things are. And while you're writing those in, a great thing to do with native plants is to plant as densely and in as many layers as you can. And whenever you can, try to remove those plants that really do make it a challenge for native wildlife. What kind of plants are people loving?
Cheryl wrote in that she has bee balm.
Oh, lovely.
I love as well. It's a really good one.
I wonder if you've had, Sharon, a lot of bees on your bee balm.
Yep, bee balm for bees and Joe Pye for butterflies. Mm-hmm. Joe Pye weed and milkweed are all getting mentioned.
That's awesome.
Native honeysuckle. It's a good one.
Yay! So let's take a little bit of a dive and think about how we can add more to our palette of plants that we can add about. So more lawn, less lawn, and more native plants is a great thing. Here you see Byron House, which if you're coming down the lane, it's kind of tucked between very wild meadows that milkweed is just coming up in and doing great. And when we have school programs, or had them most recently, our field trips, we have just enough lawn cut out to allow us to bring class groups into that cut space and use that. And there's a lovely oak tree that's very close to the building that was used as a little shady spot. So the students are surrounded by nature and wild spaces, but they also have a space that's conducive to staying together, not being in the tallest grass as they move through, and being able to play games. So we had the lawn match our need. Now, a good reason to have that is it actually is flowing somewhere, and if it's trying to flow through a thick meadow, it's gonna have a much better chance of being really clean once it reaches our creeks. And of course, it provides fabulous habitat for wildlife. And if you could put those native plants in dense layers and fill it in, you actually solve some of the challenge of keeping and beating back invasives. It takes a while. So here is our little shade garden near the driveway circle, and it looks very wild and woolly, and I kind of like it. It does need some weeding, but you'll notice that there are layers in that garden. We have those beautiful, beautiful oak leaf hydrangea, which are just absolutely gorgeous right now. And then you have at the edges some foam flower, which are hanging out that have already bloomed, but they were quite pretty earlier this spring. Then we have a little bit of aster that's trying to grow a little bit. We also have Rudbeckia, brown-eyed Susans that are like in the shade spot that are absolutely filling it up. And right now blooming in this garden is a lot of spiderwort. So compact plants along with sort of mid-level and taller plants, and then sort of centered up with the hydrangeas that create layers. These layers provide wildlife more spaces. It mimics what forests and meadows and other spaces do naturally. Now, let's think and look at this picture a little bit. There's a lovely house. If we're thinking about habitat and a great place to live for birds and other wildlife, based on what we've talked about, what kinds of things are missing here? If you could drop that in the chat and let me know, that would be great. Any ideas?
Looks like Cheryl said no cover for birds.
Excellent observation.
Kathy says about everything is missing other than grass.
Very accurate.
Also very accurate observation. There's lots and lots of grass to mow. Can you imagine the time and the gas and the expense to mow this? But in terms of having just one task to do, I guess there is some ease. The cost of that, besides the expense of gas and pollution, is that in terms of habitat and wildlife value, unless you're a robin catching maybe one errant or a few errant insects, there's not a lot of variety in that lawn. The lawn is all maybe 1.5 to 2 inches high, and there's a middle layer that's missing. So there's not a lot of places to hide. There are a few trees that could provide great spots for birds to hop from a hawk, and you're in the middle of this lawn. It's not going to look good for you at all. It's a terrible place. So how could we transform this space? You can think about reducing the lawn and adding that middle layer so that you have from the ground up the sort of layering effect that will allow birds and other wildlife to have places to hide, find shelter, actually spread out. For example, if you enjoy birding and you go into a woodland or look across a meadow, you find some birds, or even just looking out the window at your feeder, you'll notice some birds are always on the ground. The doves are hanging out because that's where they like to be. They'll fly to the ground. Then you have the ones that are hanging sort of like on your feeder desperately. And then you have those that just sort of fly in, grab something, and then fly to the highest tree they can find. So birds and other wildlife often have zones that they operate best in. And when you have layers in your habitat, you actually give them the spaces that they need to live best. All right, so we've got a sense of some basic design principles. Yes, Mary Helen?
Samantha, I think we can swap screen sharing if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're starting to get some more feedback.
While you're doing that, I actually got a question here. It says, how do we prevent birds food from squirrels? So I'm assuming, how do we prevent squirrels from getting into bird-specific food sources?
That's a challenge. There may be some of you out there who have some strategies, and please feel free to share. For us at Pickering, it's really hard. I had one feeder that was not squirrel proof, but fairly close. And then once one squirrel sat on the ground for hours, figured out how to shimmy up one time, every squirrel in our neighborhood figured out how to do it. So it's an ongoing challenge that you can find some commercial things like the squirrel spinner and things that exclude squirrels, but it's an ongoing challenge. And you know, squirrels may not have much money. They may or may not be the brightest souls, but you've got to give them real points for being the most persistent, hardworking souls ever when there's a food opportunity for food. So I hope that helps a little bit. You can find some stuff out there that helps for a little while. Baffles here help us out sometime, but if there's any leaning grass or any leaning anything, they'll figure it out. I had a mama squirrel and her baby squirrel at Pickering basically wait for the food, climb up, broke in, threw the feeder on the ground several times before I figured it out. And I came in the back and they're looking at me as I'm looking at them, accusing them of eating all the bird food. So can be tough. Now, about those basic needs, how to enjoy our birds and enjoy the squirrels without them eating all the things. Provide what birds need. We all start with the basics, food. Everyone needs to eat. And then, of course, making sure there's access to clean water. Outside of getting good food, sometimes we don't realize how important a little bit of water can be for wildlife. So it can be something as simple as a little dish that gets changed regularly or a little trickling water source. And then of course, we need those areas to shelter. Shelter is important for nesting, protection from weather. And think about it, if you have birds and you're attracting birds, you're also attracting bird predators sometimes, which are also birds. So having that shelter is very important, both to get away from the weather and to find protection from predators, and also for nesting sites. So, of course, you can have bird houses and nest boxes, and those are wonderful if you're keeping check on them. But if you're planting in a way that offers those resources, you can literally provide all of the pieces of habitat they need without adding extra things. Next slide. So let's get started with food because that's important. And for birds, we often have images in our head, and you may have some already. When you see a hummingbird, you immediately, maybe you have that picture in your mind of a hummingbird visiting a flower in your garden, maybe the coral honeysuckle or some other tubular red flower. And so you think of nectar. Or we imagine a bird sitting with berries in its mouth, and that's true, and that's good. Or if you're feeding birds in the winter, you know that a lot of nuts and seeds can be eaten up, especially over the course of winter. And then at the center of that, though, are insects. Birds of all species, if you're trying to attract a variety, need something from all those categories. There's the nectar that provides the sugars and fast energy, the nuts and seeds with fats, and stuff that really help them in colder weather or before to get ready to migrate. Just think about berries being also sweet treats to kind of keep you going and pumped up during a good nesting season. So while you're delivering insects and other yummies to your babies, which is high in proteins and fats. So having plants that provide those resources, including providing access to the insects which are attracted to plants. So it's a very important part of bird diets. And if you invite the birds to your neighborhood with a buffet, they will come. So let's see what this buffet will look like. We're going to explore some plants. We're going to be focusing on native plants because they have established relationships with the wildlife here, have been around a really long time. Let's compare it. For example, among species of oaks, over 500 caterpillar species can be found using oaks, from the seeds to the leaves, all over. So 500 species of basically Lepidoptera, butterflies, things of that nature. Now let's compare it to ginkgos, which are a really pretty tree. They're not native, so they don't have the established relationships. 4 species of native caterpillars will use ginkgo. Now, if you're thinking about providing buffet, do you want to provide 4 species or upwards of over 500 species? Next slide. And really, this is important, that idea that native plants have relationships with our insects and vice versa. For example, I'm sure many of you know who this little crawler is. Any ideas in the chat? If you said monarch, you would be right. And you might notice this on a type of milkweed. This is a lovely version to have in your gardens. If you find that having, this is actually butterfly milkweed. And of course, monarchs have sort of relationship with milkweeds in general, and it's a host plant for its babies. Of course, when the monarchs turn into a lovely butterfly, they're not palatable and they're not going to be what the birds eat, but pretty much about 90% of the insect species here and where we live have a relationship with one host plant. Many of them are quite delicious, according to the birds. So next slide. So maybe this is a little bit of a hyperbole. A world without insects is a world without birds, but insects are really, really important. Just ask this junco. Let's look at the next slide. As a matter of fact, if you feed the bugs, most of the birds that we're seeing in our yards that we enjoy, hopefully on a daily basis, 96% of North American birds, other than those that we're going to see in our boats and out in the water, are eating insects, which contain more protein than beef. So this little chickadee here is really eating insects, and if you go to the next slide, finding as many insects as they can, especially caterpillars, to feed to their young. So let's look at the next slide. If you think about that chickadee, it's about the size of 2 nickels. And if you look at the little speckled eggs and the babies in the nest, if you look at your pinky finger and imagine sort of the tip of your pinky finger, that's about the size of these babies. They take about 16 days from eggs to fledging, and during that time, the parents are working feverishly to deliver caterpillars and insects as fast as possible. How many caterpillars do you think it might take those parents to fledge, to raise and successfully fledge their babies? Any guesses? Not a clue. It's a lot. If you said a lot, that would be a good answer. It's been estimated that it takes upwards of 9,000 caterpillars to raise those babies from eggs to fledging. 9,000. Now here's something to think about. Those parents are working hard and delivering insects every few minutes. Chickadees in general don't forage much more than 50 feet away from their nest. So if they're going to find upwards of 9,000 caterpillars in the just over 2 weeks it takes to raise their young, it would be great if there are wonderful species of plants that are hosting and providing the insects that they need. Next slide, please. So if you're shopping for trees and you're trying to find something that might be a lovely addition to add to your yard for shade and interest and be great for your bird neighbors, this is a great list to start with. This is, again, some research that Doug Talmy had pulled together, but we are looking at, again, oaks, over 500 species of caterpillars related to that. Willows are not shabby in terms of the species that you can pull in. And of course, cherry, birch, aspen, crabapple, blueberry, maple fall on that list. These are really great choices. So native plants are definitely, in terms of providing the resources, are a good choice. But among native plants, there are some clear winners in this, at least in terms of the trees. Let's look at the next slide. And remember, there's a lot of insects out there that are bug yummy. Who'd like to guess what this charming little insect might be when it grows up?
It's one of my favorites.
If you know Mary Helen, take your second guess. So it is not quite the monarch, but it is a lovely, and for birds and other insect eaters, it's a yummy viceroy. So willows are a host plant for viceroy butterflies. So as you prepare and make your neighborhood or yard great for birds, remember, you're also providing a way for other wildlife to be successful. Let's go to the next slide. So what about our little friend here, the wood thrush? How could we help make this bird successful? Let's think about it migrating from North America down to Central America. Can you imagine if you're flying, you're going to need some really good, nutritious food packed with calories. Let's check out some other plant sources. We talked about insects. Let's move on to fruit. You know, spicebush would be a really great choice for fruit. That's good, high in fat, really great travel food. So spicebush, like many other fall fruiting plants, are high in fat and really great for migratory birds. Another one is coming up next in the next slide. Dogwood, flowering dogwood also provide those nice fatty fruit. And in the spring and summers, when you have a nest, if you're on a bird, it's a great opportunity to get some fruit for yourself while you're running down all those insects for your babies. Bluebirds, anybody who's ever tried to grow blueberries in your yard, blueberries are hard to keep for yourself. They get shared a lot. It's because they're really excellent bird food, and the birds know it. I have yet to see very many blueberries out at Pickering Creek in our woodlands that are ripe. Cherries, the wild cherries that we often see along our lane here at Pickering, are also a really great source of food. In our next slide. But here's a fruit that you may not think of very much as a fruit selection, but it's really great. Eastern red cedars. These waxy berries, again, very high in fat. It's a great place to see waxwings and others who really enjoy that for its fruit. But another great value of Eastern red cedars is as an evergreen that has sort of dense configuration. It's really great as a sheltering spot, as well as fruit that overwinter and provide a good food source. Next slide. Now let's move into nectars. Columbine is a great beginning of the season nectar source. It starts blooming pretty early, late March through April, and those are lovely, attractive flowers for hummingbirds and other pollinators, and they're nice and early. So it's an easy, also columbine is such a great, easy addition to a garden. They they sort of self-propagate pretty easily. The seeds are easy to collect, easy to save, and they have not only interesting flowers, but interesting leaves. And if you're sort of new to the world of trying out natives, this is a great first stop in terms of a nice plant to try out in a garden setting, to see how natives work in your yard. And it gives you the opportunity to enjoy hummingbirds and others. Let's look at the next slide. And we already heard a mention of our native honeysuckle or coral honeysuckle. Those are fantastic. When the columbine has sort of died back, the honeysuckle are still going strong. So they'll be still blooming and going strong for the rest of this month into next month. And again, very attractive to hummingbirds, has that sort of characteristic red and orange colors, very attractive, and brings in the hummers. Actually, up at the settler's garden where we worked on it, along the little cottage there, is a great old coral honeysuckle bush, and a little hummingbird buzzes in and out of there on a regular basis. Next slide. If you're thinking about hummingbird food, it's not only red flowers that are super attractive. Jewelweed is a great choice for hummingbird food. It can be in yellow and bright orange. It's also a great choice to fill in that season when the coral honeysuckle starts winding down, sort of late summer. These blooms will be out, and then they continue quite some time. So if you go to the next slide, you can see they're also a great food for hummingbirds to check out. If we could head to the next slide, please. So let's switch gears and think about the seeds, things that can be little packets that are eaten right away, or even stashed like this acorn this Jay will probably stash. And at Pickering Creek, where we have such nice woodlands, not only our oaks, but also the hickories and the beeches provide a lot of food for jays and other birds and other mammals that are enjoying and need something to sustain them through the winter. If you look at the next slide, please. But sometimes it might be easy to forget that something like pine trees also have really nutritious seeds, even though they're small on a cone. These are a great source of food and are used by things like this brown-headed nuthatch. And our next slide. And don't forget, grasses have their place. It's very easy to think of trees and tree nuts, but grasses and grass seeds provide lots and lots of food sources for this palm warbler and many other birds that we think of in our meadows, like, well, the warblers and also the sparrows. Tons of sparrows out along the edges of the wetlands in those meadows that we have at Pickering. Next slide. Now, we've thought for quite some time about food sources and looking at the native plants, looking at a few options to consider that provide food. But remember, water is important. And if you're thinking about adding a few more native plants and doing a little bit more gardening with natives, you might also want to think about putting out a source of water. It could be something as simple as a little tray or a watering pan that is changed out to keep the water fresh and clean, or a trickling sort of fountain would also work. The next slide. So it doesn't have to be this fancy, but you can be creative in your space to make it both interesting for you and appealing, but also attractive to birds. Let's go to the next slide. And also don't forget, when you have native plants, especially in layers, you're providing opportunities for shelter and nesting sites. Thinking about adding things like native evergreens is a great opportunity to provide dense places for birds to dive into and create pretty hidden nesting places. Next slide. If you have space in your yard and you have sort of that edge in a rural setting, you may want to consider not just chipping up all your stuff, but actually leaving and creating a brush pile. Why would you want a brush pile with all those sticks? That's a great place in the winter where you have those sticks as your structure for small birds like sparrows to actually be able to dive in and hide and take shelter. If you also leave your leaves be, you actually provide an additional food source. Can we go to the next slide? So when you leave the leaf litter around and use a brush pile, you help little ones like this white-throated sparrow that love hopping about on the ground, that are looking for resources in terms of insects low to the ground. This is a great, brush piles, don't really use those. We've used little brush piles at Pickering near our feeder just as a great place to escape and hide. And we often see white-throated sparrows and other sparrows zipping in and out of the brush pile. So it's definitely a resource that they use. Again, if you're in a place, in a setting, and you have space, it's good to allow the leaves, if you can, to stay and overwinter. There are a lot of insects that overwinter specifically in leaf litter and in leaf piles. So by leaving those there, you're actually helping. It sort of mulches the ground. It provides a place for those insects to stay and provides a buffet for birds as they come in the spring. Next slide. And again, if it's practical and safe, and you have a snag or basically a tree that has died and left a standing piece, that's really great. For us at Pickering, we have a lot of woodpeckers because we have a lot of trees that are safely in the woods in places where they can be allowed to stand. A lot of older trees also with knot holes and cavities. So great spots to leave snags open for sheltering, resting, actually collecting food in terms of insects that are eating in dead wood. So snags, if you can have them in a safe place, and you may want to consider leaving it until it decays and falls on its own if it's in a safe place. Next slide. So that's a lot to think about. How does all that boil down into doing something in your yard? You want to add some native plants? Well, how do you get started? Well, here at Pickering Creek, the Settlers Garden, we have a big vision of sharing a little bit about native plants with everyone and showing them how they can use the spaces around their home as places where native plants can be added, and adding some texture, beauty, and creating a space for wildlife. So let's check out and take a look at the plan and see what we're actually doing. Look at the next slide. We've had some really awesome volunteers help us to think about and plan out, well, what do we want to do? So we actually thought big, and it's okay. We thought, well, how, if we had all the money we needed and all the time and all the resources, how would we like to build out this space from what it was before? You can do the same. You probably have a space that you're thinking about. It could be small, it could be large, that you want to revamp, or maybe just add a few more things to. Or if you're a gardener that just loves going in, you might want to change up things a little bit each year and add on things. For us, if you notice the 4 dots at the bottom and along that line, that actually represents, just under those dots is our lane. And at the front of that space is actually, we've added shrubs there. IT, or Virginia Sweet Spire. They're doing great. They draw in lots of pollinators. And then if you notice, if you walk into the area between the 4 dots, that's the walkway, and that central garden, Pollinator Island, is what the students also planted last year. Now, there's a lot of other stuff on this. You also see the sundial, which is already there, the picket fence, which is here, and of course the little cabin. And then there's some other sculpted out spaces. We're thinking big. We may not do all these things, but we are adding on a little at a time. So dream big and maybe start small. What could we add on the side? We have some plans to make it a bigger area with more flowering perennials, and maybe adding a tree in the future. Right now, it is under tarps and it's under construction because we're trying to kill the weeds that are there and then think about expanding it later in the fall, if that's a possibility. So it's okay to do things in small, doable pieces. Right now, our goal is also to keep the center bed and the front as neat as we can and see how things are going in the area. And it's doing fantastic. So next slide. Once you've thought big and you have a place that you know you want to add more native plants to, that you want to do a little extra gardening in, maybe to expand on an existing garden bed or create a whole new space in your yard, or take on your whole yard if you're ambitious. You may be thinking, well, we've seen a few plants here, that's really great, but that's not nearly enough for me to get started. Audubon has a really nice resource, the Native Plants Database. You can go ahead and put in your zip code and literally find native plants that would work by zip code. It does ask for your email address. You don't have to add it if you don't want to. If you'd like to, that's great, and they will literally email your list of things that you find to you. If you go to the next slide. One of the nice things about this database is that you can look for many kinds of plants, from shrubs, perennials, etc. And you'll also notice that beside each plant in the description, you'll get a sense of what kinds of birds it can support. You can also go to the next slide. If you have a specific challenge, like you want to fill in that middle layer that's often missing in landscapes, and you want to try out some new shrubs, you can click on just shrubs and search that way. Next slide. And of course, it does direct you to local resources like us here at Pickering Creek Audubon Center. And if you're looking for places to buy those plants, at the next slide, you can search for some sources of native plants, both online and in the local area. This is an ever-evolving list. So if you know of some other great places locally where the folks are providing native plants and you think they should be on that list, let us know. And we'll ask that this be updated. But this is a great place to start. I encourage you to check it out. And of course, as every gardener knows, put the right plants in the right place. And this big meadow, goldenrod, and milkweed fit right in. Big sunny spaces are great. So when we think about sun, soil, and water, the same rules of thumb go for native plants as they do for more traditional garden spaces. Look at the next slide, please. And if you're looking also for other sources and maybe some ideas, like you have a very deer-ridden spot, or you have a slope, or other special concerns. This guide right here, it's very hard to find in print, but you can still find it online, the Wildlife Habitat and Conservation Landscaping Guide. It's not exhaustive, but it has really great sections for grasses, herbaceous plants, wetland herbaceous plants, emergence, trees, shrubs. It also has some really cool lists in the back to help you, to give you some tips on how to deal with that slope, or what to put in a wet area, or maybe some ideas for a shady spot. So it's a really fun guide. I know that some of you may already be very familiar with it. It's a great place to start. Okay, next slide. Now, there are so many reasons to try out adding natives and inviting birds and other wildlife in your yard. Besides providing that amazing habitat and increasing sort of the size of your neighborhood, you get a lot of exercise out in the garden for sure. And I'm sure we all need everything we can to have good mental health. In the long run, it saves time and money to plant natives. I say in the long run because, of course, like any other project, there is money and time invested in planting small plants that take time to establish. But once you've established a planting area, maybe a small meadow or a small patch, and it's grown in, you spend less and less time with it. And of course, you know, if you add something as wonderful as an oak or other large tree, that increases your property value and increases curb appeal. And of course, if you're planting in layers and reducing lawn, think about the reduction in pollution, the reduction of money you're spending on gas for mowing, and the cleaner water that you're getting out of that as a bonus. And of course, if things are planted thickly enough, it reduces the work you have to do in removing invasives once they build in. So, and when we have a yard that we've worked in, it gives us a wonderful sense of place. Next slide. So I encourage you to dig in, start small, dream big, and try out things and share. We'd love to hear from you. We've had some really fun experiences this past year or two. Not only have we worked with our students to plant native plants and create habitat spaces, we've also worked with some really awesome folks who are Habitat for Humanity homeowners. If you go to the next slide. So here we have Keisha, who's in Easton, who's just a working mom. She has 3 little busy kids, and she was like, okay, you're willing to work with homeowners to create a garden space? All right, but I want to keep it small. I want to have something right by my porch. She loves her garden. This is just started. This is 2 summers ago. Now she's going into her 3rd summer and they're doing great. So taking on native plants, adding stuff for wildlife and also for beautification of your yard is really awesome. It can empower everyone to get involved in doing something good for ourselves and for wildlife. Also remember, it can be small or it can be larger. Let's look at the next homeowner. This is Nora. She was so enthralled and she's always loved her yard anyway. She transformed her entire front yard, which was just a frustration of crabgrass for her, and basically planted it out. So the entire length of her house, she's planted it out. We added stuff like lots of butterfly weed, fire pink. There's just so much in there. She really fell in love with coral honeysuckle. She loved Joe Pye, which is out of the picture, but on the side there by her curtained in porch. And it's just been a joy and pleasure. She had such a great time making the space her own. So our experience working with Habitat homeowners was so fruitful and delightful to see people, some who had never even gardened before, much less thought about wildlife and native plants and doing that on. And they're coming into their first homes and then they're really taking it on and making it their own. And to see them be successful has been a really great experience, I think, for all of us at Pickering Creek. So the next slide. So the possibilities are there. We all have the opportunity to help this wood thrush to maybe be our neighbor, or at least a regular visitor as it passes through one way or another through our area. And I hope you have that opportunity. So that's the end of our program for tonight. We're gonna stop screen sharing. And I'd love to hear any questions you have, any comments you have for the next few minutes. It's to you, Mary Helen.
Thank you, Samantha. So thank you so much for all of that wonderful information. And we'll just take a minute. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and start to put those in the chat while I say a couple of words. So we wanted to thank you all for joining us for today's presentation. We're really glad that you have joined this community conservation effort. It takes a collaboration of all of us to restore the places that birds need. We ask that If you are able to do so, please make a donation to Pickering Creek Audubon Center. While we are part of the National Audubon Society, we have to raise all funds locally in order to afford community programming like this. We rely on our supporters so that we can keep our commitment to offering free programs. During the chaos of COVID, some of our foundation funders have put a hold on grant making, and we weren't able to bring in the revenue expected from school field trips this spring. We also had to cancel our spring fundraiser, Tour Toast and Taste. So we need your gift to help to offset staff costs to create this content. So if you found tonight's session valuable, please make a donation today to Pickering Creek. We'll include the link in the follow-up email, and we'll also post it in the chat. Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Harrison, who's going to read some questions if we have any, and Samantha.
Absolutely. Before we get to questions, I just wanted to briefly mention that I will be putting the links into the chat box, and we will also be including some of them in the email tomorrow. So if you're interested in the Plants for Birds website, which is really an amazing resource that has a lot of information locally, I'll be including that link. I'm also including a link to our upcoming programs. We have 2 upcoming programs in the next 2 weeks. One is going to be next Friday, the 26th, which is a turtle talk that's going to be held from our classroom online. It's going to be especially fun for some young ones. And then we have a Tracks and Traces as well, and that's going to be Wednesday, July 1st. So if you're interested or you have any kids or grandkids who might be interested, please take a look at the upcoming program website. So we do have a couple questions in here, I see. I see the first one is, does it make any difference when you plant milkweed in regards to this season?
In regards to, you mean when to plant milkweed?
I think so.
Okay, so milkweed you can buy it commercially. It can be sometimes tough to find. The seeds are hard to plant and start. It's hard to plant them and start them from seed, but some nurseries will carry it. If not, common milkweed, I noticed some local nurseries have had swamp milkweed. My experience with it is if you plant it in the first year, you know, it may take a little bit longer to mature. Here's an interesting thing. If you've had the milkweed kind of come up and it's kind of cut back a little bit, sometimes it'll re-sprout after it's already flowered and